Good morning, it's great to be here. Hands up for you are back at school this week. Just the teachers, no the kids, no. Yeah, I was back at school this week. It's great to be back. And those of us who have the luxury of a long break like that, a couple of months off, you kind of get back to it and you're like, flip, can I still do this? Do you ever get that? I'm looking at other teachers. Do you ever come back in the class and be like, can I actually remember how to do this? It feels a bit like that this morning because, if I'm honest, I haven't spoken here over the summertime, since the beginning of July, and I'm up here and I'm like, do I remember how to preach? It feels a bit like that this morning. I just want to say massive thanks to all the folks who stepped in and did kids during the summertime to give our kids team a break. That was absolutely fantastic. I really thank all those that contributed and spoke so brilliantly on the Sundays and for others. It's just such a healthy part of our annual kind of church rhythm to take it a little bit sort of easier during the summertime. So a massive thank you. And here we are, back, 7th. Is it the 7th? It is today, isn't it? September? 2 weeks from my birthday. If you just want to put that in your diaries. So anyway, let's kick off. Those of you who know me well, I'm not the most literate person. Confession time. I read my first book, grown-up book, when I was 19 years of age. And I was in Israel, of all places at the time, and I had finished reading the biography of Chris Akabusi. All the old people are going, oh, yeah. And some of you are going, who the heck is that? Jenny, you know Chris Akabusi? Come on, Finners. Do you know Finn? The adverts. So he's probably on adverts. So he's this incredible 400-meter hurdler athlete, just a real vivacious, incredible, larger-than-life kind of character. And he was a Christian. And I thought it's about time I grew up and read a book. And so I read his book. And I found in my adult life that of books that I read, I'm often drawn to stories about people. And I really, really like that. And then I thought, gosh, that wasn't the first book that I read. The first book, actually, that I read was the story about Jesus, written by the man called Mark. And so I became a Christian. Some of you know this story. I was 16 years of age. I started praying because I was desperate and I was worried about all kinds of stupid stuff in life and some of it very serious stuff in life. And I started praying, and that's how I kind of found God, by doing that. And I did that for a while. I started going to a local church. It was praise the Lord, but it was really boring, and it just wasn't where I was at. But I encountered God still by going there and all the rest. And then it was months later when the prison chaplain said to me, I was visiting the prison, said to me, we got to know this guy, and he was a really, really lovely man, and he really took interest in me as I visited with my dad, who was also visiting. That actually it'd probably be a good idea to read the Bible. I was like, oh gosh, who'd have known? Because as an early believer, nobody took me aside. Nobody took me aside and sort of walked me through those early days of being a believer. And actually, that's probably fairly common in many, many churches, actually. And it's something that we as a church wish to address. The whole area of discipleship. That we would journey alongside others. That we would walk with someone. And that we would be walked by someone. Someone would really help us in those ways. That's another thing. But this, Ken was his name, the chaplain. He gave me a copy of Mark's Gospel. He said, Paul, that would be a really good idea to read that. And it was a freebie. And on the back of it, it had like a tick box kind of thing and like a reading plan that you could read the whole book of Mark's Gospel over 30 days. There's 16 chapters in the book. And there was a recommended thing that you read each day and you tick the box. And the best bit about it was, if you ticked all the boxes and then you tore this bit of paper off the back of the book of Mark's Gospel and you sent it in, you got sent a free copy of the whole New Testament. I thought, that's a winner. I'm going to get myself a freebie, a free Bible. That's brilliant. Little did I know that probably loads of people give away Bibles, but there you go. And being a rule keeper, I did that. And I began a journey, a lifelong habit of reading a bit of the Bible every single day. And I read it and I was just like, gosh, who'd have known all this stuff's in the book? There were aspects of it I thought were absolutely bewildering. Some of the things were amazing. Lots of the things that I read about, I hadn't got a clue what it meant. I thought it was just wacky and weird and strange. And actually, the more I read of Mark's Gospel, the more questions that I had. And if I'm really, really honest, having read, where's the black version? This one here. I read this on holiday over the course of about 3 or 4 days, the whole bit. And I wrote loads and loads of notes on the side bit there. And as I read it through, again, being totally truthful with you, there's whole bits of it. I'm like, I'm not quite sure what that means. Doesn't that instill confidence in you? Thankfully, there are more literate people than I. Thankfully, there are loads of resources at our fingertips where we can go, where there's much more people that have much better knowledge that help us understand about the book. And so today we embark on Mark's Gospel, this whole incredible story, this account about the person of Jesus. And we would encourage you to get hold of a copy, either one of those that has been shared. Please do that. And then next week we will hopefully have loads of copies there, and you can come early to collect your book of Mark's Gospel. Folks, over the course of the next few weeks, we want to achieve a few things. And like any good teacher, we have some objectives, or in school we call them learning intentions. But here they are. First of all, we're inviting you, our people, into deeper communion and discipleship with Jesus. The point I forgot to make is this. You can read a book, a biography about a famous person. You can learn some really cool stuff about them, about their life and their background and what have you, and that's it. But you're never going to know the person. You're just going to know about them. Whereas when we read the Gospel of Mark, or any of the Gospel accounts that we find in the Scriptures, by reading them through the person of the Holy Spirit, we actually have the ability to get to know the person, the main character of the book, which is Jesus. Secondly, we want to go deeper as a church, as a people. We want to grow in our literacy and our understanding and our depth and our acknowledgement and our engagement with the Scriptures. And my hope, our hope and desire is that for you, all of us, regardless of how long you've been a believer, regardless of how interested or literate or whatever it is, that you have an increased expectancy that when you sit down, you read the Bible, that you'd have a new passion for it, a longing and a greater, just competency in terms of knowing how to read the Scriptures and how to unpack it and how to find out if there's bits that you read that you don't understand. And then lastly, we'll cover this in a bit. One of the greatest themes of Mark's Gospel is in the whole area of healing and deliverance. They're common themes throughout it, where the kingdom of God, through the person of Jesus, comes up against the kingdom of darkness. And in that, there is the tension and there is war. And Jesus comes to set the captives free. And we believe today more than any that Jesus is here on earth through his people, through the person of the Spirit, to set his people free. And we are expectant as we go through the book of Mark that we are going to see greater freedom in our lives. So, where does it fit? Where does this book fit? Today, this morning, we're not going to start chapter 1, so you can close up your book if you wish to, but please do make notes. Today really is just an overview. It's just a bit of an introduction into the book. Find out a bit about who Mark was and why he wrote the book and what the themes of it are. So before we do that, let's look at where it fits within the Bible. On Wednesday morning, I started with 8A here in this school. Brilliant class, teaching all about the Bible. And I explained, like I would, 66 books. It's not just one book, it's a library of books, and it spans hundreds of years and written by many, many different authors, all inspired by God, but that God is the ultimate author. All of these spanning generations and centered around the people group, the people of Israel, God's special and chosen people that God would have a special relationship with. And over generation after generation after generation, eventually, the promised Messiah was to come. The Bible is made up of different types of book or genre of book, and the gospel is a special genre. Alongside the books of the law, poetry books, song books, prophetic books, historical books, and letters written to churches and to people, we find ourselves at the beginning of the New Testament, the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And all of them are biographies all about the person of Jesus. So what is a gospel? It's a good question. Thank you for asking. An announcement of good news is what a gospel is, and the English word for it actually comes from good spell or glad tidings, but the Greek word for it is broken into the two words there. I couldn't quite pronounce the first word, EU. How would you pronounce that? What is it? The first bit, though? You. Oh, that's, I guess, was that easy? Oh, sorry, there you go. You means good. Angelos means messenger. Put them together, we have good messenger or good news. And it was a word that was often used during and after the life of Jesus. And it was an announcement of good news. It could be the news of a royal announcement. It could be an athletic competition or the games. Or that we won a battle or an edict of some kind. This word was used to pronounce or announce or a fanfare. Good news has come, and that's what the word gospel actually means. The Gospels make real claims about who Jesus is, the implications of his life, death, and resurrection. They are trying to persuade you, making no apology of who he is and why he came. Tim Mackey writes, "The Gospels are carefully designed theological biographies of Jesus of Nazareth. They are not merely historical records. They are designed to advance a claim that will challenge the reader's thinking and behavior. The claim is that the crucified and risen Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah of Israel and the true Lord of the world. They exist because the authors believe every person needs to reckon with what happened in the story of Jesus, and the reader will be forced to make a decision about him after reading the Gospels." So, Mark is but one. Where does it fit? Why were there the need for four different Gospel writers? Well, Mark was written probably sometime between 65 and 75 AD. If we do the maths, that's about 30 years or so after the person of Jesus. Up until that point, nothing had been formally written about him. Instead, it was left to what was known as the oral tradition. Many people of those times were not literate, could not read, could not write. And so very often stories were passed down through the oral tradition, through simply telling stories. A bit like, you come around to our house for dinner, and as we chat around, we probably will come up with stories, won't we? We'll tell you the story of when this happened, and you tell us the story of when that happened. And much of the accounts about Jesus were passed down from one to another. Mark was the first to be written of the four. Matthew and Luke knew the person of Mark, and they used much of his gospel in order to write their own. So if you read Mark's gospel, or Matthew's gospel, or Luke, you will read passages which are really, really similar. They nearly read word for word. And like I said, Matthew and Luke took much of what Mark had already written and added to it or included other bits and took away bits and what have you. Matthew, Mark, Luke, the three of them together are known as the Synoptic Gospels. You may have heard of that before. The Greek word synoptic comes from syn, which meaning one, and not spelt sin as in the bad stuff that we do, but S-Y-N, sin, meaning one, optikos, meaning seeing or to see the same. Put them together. The Synoptic Gospels are one and see the same. John's gospel is altogether very different indeed, and actually is written in a much more chronological order of history in terms of time, whereas the others tend to flit about a little bit in terms of the date order in which they were written, which was common enough in ancient biographies. Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels. As I said, 16 chapters, can read it easy peasy in the month. Whenever a new person becomes a believer for the first time, very often I'll say to them, read Mark's Gospel. Why? Because it's the shortest, you can get through it. It is written at a really fast pace. Whether this is helpful or not, I had once read that the Mark's Gospel was a bit like the Hollywood version. Maybe that's helpful, maybe it's not. But meaning, it's like the film of Jesus. And bang, straight in the middle. Doesn't mention anything about Jesus' birth, but right at the very beginning, straight in at his baptism, with John baptizing Jesus. Doesn't mention any of the birth account. We don't read Mark's Gospel, we don't tend to when it comes to Christmas time, because there ain't much to say about it. And yet, there's much packed into this book of Mark, and he takes great care in describing with great detail certain events. For example, in Mark 6, the feeding of the 5,000, he makes sure to mention that the grass that they sat on was green. Mark, more than any of the gospel writers, describes the humanness of Jesus and his emotions. He shows and demonstrates and writes that Jesus was a man of sorrow, of disappointment, amazement, anger, fatigue, and more. He not only shows the person of Jesus as the Son of God, but also the human side of who Jesus is. Some of us are probably wondering, well, who's Mark? Because we understand Matthew was a disciple and John was a disciple. We might know that Luke was this guy that wrote his own gospel, but also wrote the second book, which was the Acts of the Apostle, that Luke was writing. Luke was a follower or a disciple of Paul, and that he was writing to a well-known or an important Roman called Theophilus, because it says that at the beginning of both the books that he writes, but possibly is less known about the person of Mark. And yet, much is written in the Bible about who Mark is. Firstly, his name. In first century Palestine, it was common for men to have two names. Some of us go by two names, especially here in Northern Ireland. You could be talking about some bloke called Jimmy, and then 10 years after knowing Jimmy, we find out that his real name's Frank or something like that. It's just quite a synonymous thing. Gary's here on the second row. Who'd have known? But firstly, a Hebrew name was given to a person, a Hebrew name like John. And that was the name that his friends and his relatives would have called him. And then there's a Greek or Roman Christian name like Mark that would have been given, and he would have been gone by in other spheres of his life. And so actually when we're talking about Mark, we're talking about a person called John Mark. John Mark. In Acts 12, it tells us that John Mark was the son of a woman called Mary, which doesn't tell us much, seeing as most people were called Mary that time anyway. Mary was a wealthy widow who hosted prayer gatherings in her home in Jerusalem. And this was a significant center for the early church. This was the very place that when Peter was miraculously escaped from prison that he ran to and that he went to. It was a common meeting place for the early church in Jerusalem. It's also known that this particular room had an upper room to it, and it is strongly suggested that this upper room was the room that was used for the Last Supper. And those of us Chosen fans who have watched season 5, as they've been preparing the room for the Last Supper, you will know a new character, a young man in there, that set up the room and had it all laid out specially, who goes by the name of Mark. Another biblical text that mentions him is that he is the cousin of another well-known biblical character called Barnabas. Connected to that, we read in Acts 12 and 13 that he accompanies Barnabas together with Paul on Paul's first missionary trip. However, we read in Acts 13:13 that John, Mark, leaves Paul and Barnabas and he returns to Jerusalem. It's this very thing that Mark chose to do that actually means that Paul and Barnabas fall out later. If you know the scriptures in Acts chapter 15, they have such an argument, Paul and Barnabas, that they split company and they go their own separate ways. They did this because in Acts 15:38, Barnabas wanted to bring his cousin Mark with him. Paul didn't think it was a good idea. He did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. And they have this real big bust up and they go their own way. Who'd have known within church you'd have conflict? Who'd have known that you'd fall out with people and go your own way? There it is, right in the book. Anyway, we do know that they got things sorted out, which is also a really good thing when people fall out, that we sort things out as best we can, as much as we are able to. We know that it gets worked out because Mark features in Paul's letters in Colossians, Philemon, and in 2 Timothy. Mark also turns up in Peter's first letter. Peter calls him my son. And Peter is extremely important in terms of the accuracy of Mark's gospel, because we find out that Mark is Peter's interpreter. When Peter goes about preaching the good news about Jesus, Mark is Peter's translator. We find this, the church historian Eusebius, writing in the early 300s, quotes the early church leader Papias, who wrote around 110 AD, that Mark was his interpreter. Peter clearly was the first-hand eyewitness, was at the events that Mark writes about. He was actually there. And when Peter stands and preaches in the early church, Mark is writing lots and lots of notes and interprets for him where he goes. And that's how we have confidence in the accuracy of what Mark detailed and wrote about. Peter was martyred in Rome in AD 64 by Emperor Nero, and sometime just before Peter's death, or just after it, John Mark wrote the gospel based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter and others of the events and the life of Jesus. After writing his gospel, Mark traveled preaching the gospel in regions of Italy, including Venice, and ended up in Alexandria in Egypt, where he was the first bishop there. He was eventually martyred late 60s, and in 800s AD, so centuries later, the Venetians came to Alexandria, took Mark's body back to Venice, where he is meant to have finally rested. That's a lot of information, isn't it? Makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about. It's really good when you read books, isn't it? You tell other people what you read. It's amazing. Who was it written for? It was written for a Gentile people, meaning non-Jewish. The Christians in Rome, that's where he was, that's where Peter was martyred. And it was actually during a time of great persecution of the early church. We also know this, that it was written for a Gentile audience, because he explains Jewish customs that Gentiles wouldn't necessarily have known about or understood. And he translates the languages of Aramaic and of Hebrew phrases into Greek so that they can better understand it. It was probably written in around that time, mid-60s, a traumatic time where the early church was being persecuted, very difficult, a time when you would have easily given up. But like often still in our world today, where there's great persecution, the people of God dig in, dig deep, and actually the kingdom comes in some wonderful and amazing ways. I want to show you just a brief video. The Bible Project, we've shown things before. They're absolutely brilliant. Tune in, watch this, loads more information, then a couple bits from me, and then we'll land things.
The Gospel of Mark is a book in the Bible about the life of Jesus. And the earliest reliable tradition tells us that it was written by a guy named John Mark.
Now, Mark didn't just grab a bunch of random stories about Jesus and throw them together. He's designed this book to address some really specific questions about whether or not Jesus was the Jewish Messiah.
So let's stop right there, because that's a term a lot of people like me aren't very familiar with.
Yeah, so the Messiah was a royal figure, sometimes called the Son of God, that Israel was expecting to come and set up a kingdom here on earth. And around the time of Jesus, Israel was occupied by Rome, and so many Jews were hoping that the Messiah would come and overthrow the Romans and rule as king.
But Jesus didn't overthrow the Romans. In fact, he was killed by them.
And that brings us to the very issues Mark is trying to get at in this book. So in the first half, he focuses on who Jesus is. Is he really the Messiah? And then in the second half, he's addressing how Jesus became the Messianic king. And then right here in the middle of the book is this pivotal story that brings the two halves together, and Jesus answers both of these questions.
Okay, so let's talk about the first half of the book, who Jesus is.
So Mark makes his beliefs about Jesus very clear from the first line of the book. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God.
One of the next stories is Jesus getting baptized, and God's voice announces from heaven, "This is my son." So it couldn't be more clear. It's presenting Jesus as the Messiah.
Yes, but as you're reading through this first half of Mark, you'll notice something really interesting start to happen. Jesus is going about healing all these different people, and he's constantly telling them to keep quiet about who he is. This happens so many times in Mark's account. It's very strange.
Yeah, why keep it a secret?
So remember, lots of Jews had lots of different expectations about what the Messiah would be and do. And so Jesus doesn't want people to misunderstand what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah. And so with all that in mind, we come now to the pivotal story at the center of the book, where Jesus takes his disciples away and he asks them, "Who do you all say that I am?"
And Peter says what everyone's been saying, "You're the Messiah, the Son of God."
But then something new happens, because Jesus starts explaining to them how he's going to become the Messianic king, and it is not what they expected. He says he's going to suffer and die and rule by becoming a servant, or in his words, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Peter is startled by this, and he rebukes Jesus because there's no way he's going to let Jesus die. And Jesus responds, "Get behind me, Satan," which is really intense.
It really is. But it highlights how important it is for Jesus that his disciples come to understand who he really is. And so here, now in this pivotal section, Jesus tries 3 different times to have this conversation with them, and every time they respond in confusion and even fear.
Okay, so this launches us into the second half of the book, where Mark addresses the question of how Jesus becomes the Messianic king. It's the last week of Jesus' life. He goes to Jerusalem, gets in conflict with the religious leaders, and gets arrested.
And he's put on trial as someone who's claiming to be the king of the Jews. He's even given a crown and a purple robe like a king would get, but it is all a cruel joke.
Then he's mocked and beaten and hung up on a cross where he dies.
And it's here in this crucial scene that we meet a new character,
A Roman soldier.
who suddenly gets everything that's going on.
He says, "Surely this is the Son of God."
Which is crazy. It's an enemy who's first putting it all together that Israel's messianic king is the crucified Jesus.
That's the structure of the book of Mark. But the book doesn't end with Jesus dead on the cross.
No. So on the third day, some women go to visit Jesus' tomb, only to find that it's empty. And then there's this angel standing there, instructing them to go and tell this good news that Jesus is alive from the dead. But instead, they run away and they don't tell anyone because they're afraid. And that's how the book ends.
Which is a really abrupt ending.
Yeah, it's so abrupt that later scribes did add an ending that brings more closure to the story. And you'll find that story in your Bible with a little footnote that says it was added much later. But Mark's a brilliant storyteller, and he's intentionally ended this book abruptly. So all through the book, the disciples have been confused about Jesus' plan to give up his life, the story in the middle, and now right here at the end. It's like Mark is acknowledging just how startling this claim really is. And he wants you, the reader, to wrestle with it for yourself. Is this crucified Jesus really the Messiah that they've been waiting for?
So that's the question. We live, don't we, in a turbulent time, which is probably an understatement. And we live in a time when so much of culture and society is about me and what I want and what I can get and what have you. And the religious leaders and the people at the time of Jesus were looking for a Messiah. They were looking for a chosen one who would overthrow and bring liberty to them. And Jesus did not fulfill their expectations. Instead, he came to establish a kingdom far more different than they ever expected and thought of. And today, as we gather together as people, we've tasted and we've seen that the Lord is good. And yet, if we're really honest with ourselves, very often we come before the Lord and we come in a way of, I can make my life a bit better. I just put him in my little box of discipleship. And as long as he comforts me when I'm sorrowful, we're all good. I'm being quite direct and slightly facetious in that, and I hope you understand the point I'm sort of making there. But when we truly read the scriptures and we really read the Gospel of Mark, Mark doesn't allow us to get away with our own thinking and our own wishes, but we're confronted with the real person of Jesus. And if we truly want to be disciples of his and followers of Jesus, we need to take seriously what's written in the book. So whether you're a new believer, not yet believer, or you've been a believer for many years, as we dive into this book, God is going to speak to us through it because it's his word to us. And we must take, this is my charge to you, it seriously, reverently, wholly, that we would be brave enough to welcome the Spirit, open our hearts, and open the book to see what he wants to say to us. And it's always good. It's always good. It was going to be confrontational. It will bump up against us and our wishes and our desires and our flesh. But it's always towards liberty. It's always towards freedom. It's always towards a greater knowledge and of who he is, that we die to ourselves, we take up our cross, and we follow him. And we find this through the book. And so I urge you, I encourage you, take this next season's church seriously. Commit to coming. Commit to bringing some version of it. Commit to reading it devotionally at home as well. In our life groups, which we haven't mentioned this morning, which go live shortly as well, 2 or 3 of the life groups get the opportunity to camp out on what we talk about on Sundays a bit more as well. And so we'd encourage you for that. But that's it. That's the intro. Next week, we're in chapter 1. Let's go. Anyone up for it?
Thanks for listening to the Carrickfergus Vineyard podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our church, please visit our website at carrickfergusvineyard.org.